Excellency, lieber Herr Pape, dear Dame Salmond, lieber Herr Schneider, sehr geehrter Herr Kollege Ziegler, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome you warmly to the Senate Hall of the Humboldt-Universität and thank you for coming in such large numbers. Today we are closing not only the series of Kosmos lectures, but also the Humboldt-Universität celebratory year in honor of Alexander von Humboldts 50th birthday. Many of you remember when we opened the celebration in April this year in the presence of President Steinmeier. Alexander von Humboldt sharpened his eye for the connections. He investigated the worldwide conjunctions between human and natural phenomena. For him, everything was interaction. We can and should apply what Humboldt discovered to science itself and its institutions. They are not isolated, but are integrated into networks, are in exchange, not only with other institutions traditionally intended for research, but with society as a whole. Humboldt was very aware of that. He sought dialogue not only with scientists all over the world, but also with citizens. His birthday is an occasion for us not only to look at the topicality of his work, but also to review our own connections and to create new ones between disciplines, with other actors in science, art, and politics. That what was we practiced at Berlin Science Week earlier this month, but also our first event at the Humboldt Forum in October was therefore logically an international conference on interdisciplinarity. Above all, we use the year to enter into dialogue with society in formats like as the Festival Week or the Cosmos Conference. The first steps have been taken. More will follow with the Humboldt Labor in the Humboldt Forum, the Palais am Festungsgraben, a metro station for science and the Science Campus. I hope that we will meet with as much as approval as the 250th anniversary of the birth of one of our namesake. I'm especially pleased to be able to tell you that we will continue the series of Kosmos lectures next year and will add even new formats. The opening will take place during the long night of the science in June. And for today, my thanks go to Christoph Schneider, who created the Kosmos lectures. I would also like to thank the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, with whom we have been able to work so successfully this year, and who are also supporting this evening. Thank you for that. And I now give the floor to Christian Pape.
Magnifizenz, Professor Kunst, Magnifizenz, Professor Ziegler, Your Excellency, Ambassador Holborough, Dame Anne Salmond, dear Professor Schneider, can't see him, yes. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. This year has been packed literally with publications, exhibitions, scientific conferences, and public debates remembering Alexander von Humboldt, his personality, his science, his impact, and his legacy, 250 years after his birth. One excellent example is this Kosmos lecture series, which is organized by Humboldt-University, honoring Alexander von Humboldt, and particularly also his public work. Thanks a lot to Professor Kunst, to everybody here at this university who contributed to organizing these fantastic letters. And today, obviously, we are celebrating not the final lecture of the Kosmos series, since we just learned that it will be continued last year, but at least it's the final series of this year's, the final one of this year's lecture series. And we are thrilled to have this fantastic audience here. And I can literally feel the spirit of Alexander von Humboldt in this lecture hall, and it is a little bit, looking behind me, as if he is here in person. So, but let's step back a moment and remember what the legacy of Alexander von Humboldt really is and what the origins of the lecture series are that we are reviving these days here at this place. So between fall or autumn 1827 and spring 1828, so in just 6 months, Alexander von Humboldt delivered a true marathon of lectures, close to 80s, here in Berlin, on what he called physical geography, physikalische Geographie. He spoke on the one series to fellow scientists at Berlin University, but he also spoke in a parallel series of lectures to a major public audience at Sing Academy. And in particular, his public lectures attracted a large and a most diverse audience: academics, politicians, bourgeoisie, educated and perhaps less educated, and also simple people attended. And importantly, to most of us at least, lectures were open to women at a time when universities were not. Times have changed, fortunately enough. So, but it therefore, at those days, and also to me, comes as no surprise that our knowledge and understanding of the Kosmos lectures stems not only from the notes in Humboldt's own estate, but also from notes made by one lady in the audience. And her name was Henriette Kohlrausch. She attended Humboldt's lectures at Sing Academy, and her meticulous and very detailed notes shine light on the societal impact of the Kosmos lectures and also on the charismatic personality of the lecturer, Alexander von Humboldt. And so I'm wondering who of you may be taking notes of this lecture and of the lecturer, as we will see in a minute or so. So frankly, looking back again, Alexander von Humboldt's lectures were truly spectacular, scientific accounts on various topics from electric fish to orchids, from deep lakes to volcanoes, but they also raised criticism on issues of abuse at those days, political and environmental. And I think it's also fair to state that Alexander's lectures were not just flowery description of adventures, but they were also filled with rather detailed scientific matters, including lists and lists of citations that may have seemed a little endless and perhaps a little boring to the non-specialist. But the personality and also the public image of Humboldt guaranteed an overall positive, almost exotic atmosphere of novelty, exploration, and adventure. And audiences, as you will be in a little while, were truly amazed and excited. Their understanding improved, not just of the science, but also of the critical issues. Their horizon was widened, their Weltbild, their current picture of the world was sharpened and widened. And this aspect of Alexander's contribution was aptly described at the opening lecture by our federal president, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, who said, and I'm quoting, "Humboldt hat die Welt nach Deutschland getragen. Humboldt brought the world to Germany." And I do certainly agree, and most of you will also agree with this. And this, at least to me, is perhaps the most significant and unique contribution made by Alexander von Humboldt: to merge borders of disciplines, nations, cultures, societies into a common picture of what he called the cosmos, and to communicate cosmos in a means to learn rather than a means to teach. And as you will see yourself in a couple of minutes, today's speaker, Dame Anne Salmond, shares exactly this quality with Humboldt. She is a truly excellent scientist, a brilliant speaker, and she will bring the world of her science to the world in this lecture hall. She has received the Carl Friedrich von Siemens Award of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation in recognition of her groundbreaking research in cross-cultural encounters. And I'm tempted to say, and with all of my heart, I'm saying she's a Humboldtian par excellence. So we are much looking forward to your lecture, and you will now be introduced in more detail by the curator, the ambassador will give his words of introduction before you will be introduced. Thank you.
Tehi Moriora, Ina Mana, Ina Rao, Iro Rangatirama, Tenakoto, Tenakoto, Tenakoto Katoa. That greeting will be familiar to some in the crowd, but for those for whom it is not, that is an indigenous Maori greeting, and translated it means, behold the breath of life. To all authorities, all voices, to the many chiefs gathered here, greetings, greetings, greetings to you all. It's a genuine privilege to be here this evening to enable me to thank the Humboldt Foundation and Germany for honouring Professor Dame Anne Salmond, and indirectly for honouring New Zealand. I'm looking forward immensely to hearing Dame Anne's talk this evening, as we are in the presence of someone who's very special, a treasure, a taonga, as we say in New Zealand. Professor Salmond has played and continues to play a very important role in New Zealand. She has both set an example and helped frame a conversation about what it means to be a New Zealander against the backdrop of our own historical journey. As you all know, Dame Anne has devoted her professional career to studying cross cultures, with a particular focus from a historical and anthropological perspective on Pacific communities, and especially our own Indigenous people. In helping us better understand the values, the way of life, and the philosophies which have guided our Indigenous people, Professor Salmond has chipped away at a narrative which hitherto viewed New Zealand far too exclusively through a European-centric, European-dominated lens. And we as New Zealanders, especially white Pakeha New Zealanders, we are much richer for this more nuanced, better balanced perspective. In a world which is increasingly letting us know that as a species we're doing a lot of damage to our planet, we need to be better guided by a sense of what Māori term katiakitanga, or guardianship, guardianship of our mountains, our lakes, our rivers. In a world where there are signs of nation states becoming more muscular, where discourse is becoming very raw, we need to better model the Māori value termed manakitanga, respect. Respect for ourselves and respect for each other. And in a very material world, our Indigenous people remind us how to continue to nurture our soul. A very small example of this is demonstrated by the fact that it is increasingly the norm in New Zealand to start formal meetings with a waiata, or song. How lovely is that? I make these points simply to emphasize that whilst Professor Salmond is a historian and an anthropologist, which tends to throw light back on the past, her richness, her contribution to her community is actually in helping guide us to a better future, one which promises, I believe, to make New Zealand a better country. And for that, we owe a great debt of gratitude to Dame Anne. So thank you, and I look forward to your address.
Magnifizienzen, liebe Frau Kunst, lieber Herr Ziegler, Excellence, Ambassador Holborough, New Zealand's Ambassador to Germany, dear President of the Alexander von Humboldt Stiftung, lieber Herr Pape, ladies and gentlemen, dear Professor Dame Anne Salmond, it's great to have you here. It is my pleasure, like always, in the Cosmos lecture series, to introduce the speaker and to moderate you through the evening. My name is Christoph Schneider. I'm the head of department at the Geography Department of Humboldt-Universität zu Berlin. As you know, those of you that have been following us through the year with all of the Cosmos lectures, I'm always opening it with a quote of Alexander von Humboldt. And I'm reading it out in its original form in German first, and I give you the translation after that. So, Alexander von Humboldt, über die Einheit des Menschengeschlechts, published 1852. Es würde das allgemeine Naturbild, das ich zu entwerfen strebe, unvollständig bleiben, wenn ich hier nicht auch den Mut hätte, das Menschengeschlecht in seinen physischen Abstufungen, in der geografischen Verbreitung seiner gleichzeitig vorhandenen Typen, in dem Einfluss, welches es von den Kräften der Erde empfangen und wechselseitig, wenngleich schwächer, auf sie ausgeübt hat, mit wenigen Zügen zu schildern. So in English, about the unity of the human race, published in 1852. The general picture of nature, which I strive to create, would remain incomplete if I did not also have the courage here to describe with few traits the human race in its physical gradations, in the geographical distribution of its simultaneously existing types, and in the influence which it has received from the forces of the earth and which it has exerted on it mutually, albeit to a lesser degree. So Alexander von Humboldt, you usually address him as a natural science person, a natural science hero, but in fact, he was the person to speak about human and nature as an entangled web of life. And therefore, it's obvious and it's clear that we would want to have a perspective within this Cosmos lecture series that bridges from the natural sciences that the explorer and traveler Alexander von Humboldt is so well known for, towards the human sciences and towards cultural sciences. We could not have a better speaker tonight for this purpose with Dame N, and I would shortly want to introduce Dame N to you. She has received the Master of Arts in Anthropology as early as 1968. And she received her PhD in 1972 from the University of Pennsylvania. I should say that the Master of Arts was at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. The title of her PhD was Hui, a study of Maori ceremonial gatherings. As early as 1971, she was appointed for a lectureship at the University of Auckland. She has been Pro-Vice Chancellor for Equal Opportunity at the University of Auckland from 1997 to 2006. And I find it really interesting to read that in 1999, she and her husband, Jeremy, established the Waikareru Eco Sanctuary in Gisborne, which is in the very east of the northern island of New Zealand, a great place, actually. I've been there. So as a major ecological restoration project at that time. 2001, she became a distinguished professor of Maori studies and anthropology at the University of Auckland. 2001 to 2007, she was chair of the New Zealand Historic Places Trust. In 2011, received the KEA World Class New Zealand Science, Technology and Academia Award. In 2012, the Rockefeller Foundation Fellowship at Bellagio in Italy. In 2013, she received the Rutherford Medal, New Zealand's top scientific prize of the Royal Society of New Zealand, and she became also the New Zealander of the Year for her groundbreaking work on cultural history. Since 2014, she's a member of the Air New Zealand Sustainability Panel. She leads also the Te Awaroa Voice of the River project to restore rivers across New Zealand. So while we see Alexander von Humboldt as the natural scientist that reaches out to humanities, we have a speaker that comes from the humanities and reaches out to ecology. That's great. 2015, she is the elected international member of American Philosophical Society, and from 2016 to 2018 became vice president of the Royal Society of New Zealand. And then, as Herr Pape already mentioned, in 2018 she received the Carl von Siemens Research Prize by the Humboldt Foundation in recognition of lifetime achievements in research. Salmond has written a series of prize-winning books about Maori life Actually, almost all of her publications, all of her major books have received the prize, which is really outstanding. So it's about Maori life, about European voyaging and cross-cultural encounters in the Pacific that have received really a lot of international recognition. I'm really excited how you bring us and Alexander von Humboldt behind us now from Europe and the Americas, where he was working in, to the Pacific. So the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Ko te wai e hora nei, ko te marae e takoto nei, ko koutou aku rangatira kua pai nei, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. It's such an honor and a privilege to be here tonight, and I would like to thank the Humboldt Foundation and Humboldt-University and Your Excellency, the New Zealand Ambassador, all of you who've gathered here tonight for the privilege of talking to you this evening. And Alexander von Humboldt is here looking at me quizzically, and I want to honor him tonight in the things I have to say. So on the last page of Views of Nature, Alexander von Humboldt described his first sight of the Pacific Ocean from the Andes. He said, a great body of light reflecting, ascending to an horizon, now more than merely sensed. And he paid tribute to Georg Forster, the companion of his youth, who had sailed across the Pacific Ocean with Captain James Cook. And during their early travels together in Europe, Forster's enchanting descriptions of Tahiti, says von Humboldt, inspired him with a love of scientific exploration and a yearning to follow in his wake. Back at home in New Zealand, as I speak, we are also commemorating a 250th anniversary, the arrival of Captain Cook's ship, Endeavour, which brought the first Europeans ashore. Like Humboldt's South American journey, Cook's first Pacific voyage had soaring cosmological ambition: to observe the transit of Venus, and so to estimate the size of the solar system, and to search for Terra Australis Incognita, the great unknown southern continent, which was thought to lie in the deep south of the Pacific Ocean. Through Humboldt's friendship with Georg Forster, Cook's Pacific voyages helped to sow the seeds for his all-embracing vision of the cosmos, with its emphasis on fundamental questions about the workings of the world and the dynamic interconnections of all forms of life. Though Humboldt had hoped to join Captain Baudin's expedition in Lima, in Peru, the French explorer changed his plan to enter the Pacific Ocean around Cape Horn and sailed around the Cape of Good Hope instead. And thus, Alexander von Humboldt's ambition to explore the Pacific Ocean, the largest geographical feature on the planet, was frustrated. Perhaps because of this, both Views of Nature, his favorite book, and his masterwork Cosmos describe a largely terrestrial planet, rather than the watery world that we all in fact inhabit. This celebration of the 250th anniversary of Alexander von Humboldt's birth is being held here in Berlin, near the western edge of the world's largest landmass. Aotearoa, New Zealand, on the other hand, lies at the heart of the Pacific Ocean, the world's largest ocean. And I was delighted when I went to the exhibition yesterday at the Historic Museum to find this world map by Alexander von Humboldt. And what a greeting, because there was New Zealand, most unusually, at the heart of a world map. I thought it was like a personal greeting from Alexander von Humboldt, so kia ora. Very, very lovely to see that in the exhibition. This vast sea, which covers almost a third of the Earth's surface, has helped to shape our identity in New Zealand. Perhaps 80 million years ago, New Zealand floated away from the ancient continent of Gondwana land, evolving in isolation with its plants and animals. The naturalist Jared Diamond has described New Zealand as the world's smallest continent or the world's largest islands. For a biologist, he remarks, examining the New Zealand biota is the closest we will get, and I quote, the opportunity to study life on another planet. So before the first human beings came ashore, living systems had been co-adapting there for millennia, creating an extraordinary array of endemic species, including flightless birds, giant snails, even walking bats. We now know that the ancestors of many of these creatures floated, flew, or were blown there. They had to survive a long and difficult oceanic journey, or airborne, and adapt to environments very different from those in their homelands. And as they moved into new niches, this sparked rapid innovation and the emergence of new species. It seems that something similar may have happened in the case of human beings. In New Zealand, our ancestors had to be bold and innovative to cross the Pacific Ocean. In order to reach this very remote archipelago, the ancestors of Maori had to invent blue water sailing long before the Vikings crossed the deep ocean. And when the first star navigators from island Polynesia landed in New Zealand about 700 years ago, this became the last significant landmass on the planet to be found and settled by human beings. They also had to quickly adapt to landscapes very different from their tropical island homelands. So far from being a static, steady-state, traditional society, Māori life was dynamic and rapidly changing. And in the 450 years or so before European arrival with Cook, Māori invented a new language, cosmology, art forms, fashioned new kinds of watercraft and buildings, and mastered new fibre, stone, and agricultural technologies. Sometimes they made mistakes, setting fires that ran out of control and exploiting some local species to the point of extinction, including the moa, the large flightless bird that was their best source of protein. Nevertheless, the rate of successful innovation was very impressive, and different ways of life, products, and ideas emerged in different parts of the country. According to Māori philosophy, the world begins with a surge of energy, followed by knowledge, thought, memory, desire. And it wasn't until Hauora and Hautipu, the winds of growth and life, blew through the cosmos, that Rangi and Papa, the earth, mother and the sky father, emerged, followed by stars, plants, animals, and people. In this way of thought and this way of being, all the world is a vast kin network, powered by the winds of life and growth, one living system, one source of life. And in this relational cosmos, mind and matter are not split, nor are knowledge and desire. Space-time is a spiral. Life returns to the ancestral source and then spins out again into the future. Earth and sky, stars, sea, winds, people, and other life forms are linked together, driven by mutual exchanges. When balance is achieved, families, communities, and ecosystems alike are in a state of order. Order is health, prosperity, well-being. If reciprocity fails, however, entire networks and their members begin to fail and become mate, or sick, unhealthy and dysfunctional. This can apply to individuals, to families, to communities, to countries, perhaps even to the planet. And this idea of a dynamic, pulsing cosmos is contemporary and futuristic, with patterns of complex networks and spirals that are also found in cutting-edge science. So like those first Polynesian voyages, the first Western explorers to arrive in New Zealand, Abel Tasman and Captain James Cook, faced formidable challenges. In order to cross the Pacific and reach these remote islands, European mariners had to perfect the art of sailing for long periods over great distances. In 1769, 250 years ago, when the Endeavour made its landfall on the east coast of New Zealand, the Royal Society scientists on board, led by the wealthy young botanist, Joseph Banks, whom Humboldt would meet 20 years later in London, thought that they had discovered Terra Australis Incognita, the great unknown southern continent, fabled to be rich in gold and silver and spices, with Rajas riding around on elephants. Instead, it turned out to be my hometown of Gisborne. And at that time, life in Europe was also in a phase of explosive innovation. Modernity began in Europe around the 1760s, just as the Endeavour brought the first Europeans ashore in New Zealand. The Royal Society of London, which had sponsored James Cook's expedition, was at the cutting edge of the Enlightenment, characterised by many new inventions in the arts, manufacturing, agriculture, governance, and science. On board the Endeavour, there was a cargo of colliding cosmological ideas. These included, for example, the old, originally Greek, but then later medieval motif of the great chain of being, which had God at the apex of the cosmos, followed by a divine monarch and the serried ranks of the aristocracy, down to commoners, barbarians, and savages, sentient and non-sentient animals, insects, plants, and rocks. And those at the bottom of the great chain were expected to offer up deference and tribute to those at the top, who exercised top-down authority and control. And this was partly based on ancient mythic framings, including, for example, the Genesis story of creation, which gave Adam and Eve, as we all know from the Bible, dominion over fish, plants, birds, animals, men over women, and so on. In the logic of the great chain of being, a divine sovereign ruled over his or her people, which gives you the notion of sovereignty in a hierarchical, God-given form of cosmic order. Aristocrats ruled over commoners, civilized people over barbarians and savages, free citizens over slaves, human beings over all other life forms. And on board a naval vessel like the Endeavour, this form of order was mirrored in the chain of command from the commander to the cabin boy. When time was added to the great chain of being, stadial theories of human history emerged, an unfolding of human progress from the savages who were hunters and gatherers, to barbarians who were herders and agriculturalists, to civilized commercial and industrial societies. This ancient mythic framing has proved to be curiously resilient. It still underpins many contemporary ideas about relationships amongst people. The sovereignty of nation states, for example. Sexism and the idea of the glass ceiling. Racism and the domination of civilized over indigenous peoples. People over all other life forms. In resource management and ecosystem services, for example, which assume that these life forms were created for the uses and purposes of people. Many corporate structures also echo this form of order with their hierarchies and top-down styles of control. In contemporary capitalism, 99% of people are expected to offer up deference and tribute to the 1% who now own most of the planet. In Enlightenment science, a second powerful framing device was Cartesian dualism, and this has been greatly studied by many philosophers and historians. And when the French philosopher René Descartes set up the thinking subject as the guarantor of his own existence, with cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, he conjured up a world in which mind was split from matter. Res cogitans versus res extensa, subject from object, reason from the emotions, culture from nature, people from the environment, and ultimately the social from the physical sciences. In this way of knowing, reality was transformed into arrays of bounded objects, at different scales that could be counted, classified, and commodified. The order of things, as Michel Foucault has called it, through the quantification of space, time, people, and other life forms. Back in the 18th century, as the order of things went viral, many aspects of life were transformed simultaneously with the invention of censuses, of surveying, bureaucracy, industry with mechanization and replicable processes, and science with the use of instruments and quantification. Also the split between the natural sciences and the arts, and their fragmentation into different disciplines, the origins of siloed thinking. On board the Endeavour, this kind of thought was exemplified in part by the ship's log, with its gridding of both time and space, the classification of plants and animals using Linnaean taxonomy, and Cook's charts of the Pacific with their gridded latitude and longitude and their eye of God perspective. So this order of things, you might say, at this time in the mid-18th century, gridded the world. And this has been transforming space into time ever since into commodities that could be bought and sold in the market. And many contemporary inheritors of this kind of gridded habit of mind, which is a cultural artifact, not the way the world is or has to be. It laid the basis for ideas of objectivity, empirical knowledge based on detached observation, experiment and control, and contemporary capitalism with its ruling ideas of ownership and the autonomous, property-owning, rights-bearing individual. But a third strand of Enlightenment thinking, which I've sometimes called the order of relations, relational thinking. In this kind of way of thinking, which was simultaneous, it was the same in the same period, the iconic form of order was the web. And at this time in Europe, thinkers including Buffon in France, Erasmus Darwin, Joseph Priestley, and most of the Scottish Enlightenment, Charles Darwin in England later, and Alexander von Humboldt in Germany, saw the world as a web of life, shaped by networks of relations among and within different life forms, animated by interactions among complementary forces. People live in the heart of these complex relational networks and are not separated from them in this way of thought. And as it happens, this kind of habit of mind resonates closely with Māori and Pacifica cosmological ideas and contemporary ecological thinking as well. In his masterwork Cosmos, for example, Alexander von Humboldt writes about a wonderful web of organic life that was animated by one breath. From pole to pole, one life is poured on rocks, plants, animals, and even into the swelling breast of man. A breath that came from the earth itself, a vision that bears an uncanny resemblance to Te Ao Māori, the Māori cosmos, with its array of complex networks animated by Hau, the breath of life. In this web of life, people are just one life form among many, and the world is constantly changing. Ancestral ideas from Europe, such as justice, truth, equality, and honour, help to determine how exchanges among people ought to be handled. On board the Endeavour, Cook's ship, this kind of thinking was reflected in the hints given to Captain Cook by the Earl of Morton, who was at that point the president of the Royal Society of London, a Scottish astronomer, who insisted on the rights of Indigenous people to own and protect and defend their own territories. So he disputed and totally disagreed with the idea of the right of discovery, for example. Here one can also find, in this kind of thinking, the origins of participatory democracy, and here we find Alexander von Humboldt so much at home. The emancipation of women and slaves, the earth sciences, evolutionary and environmental theory, the World Wide Web, the science of complex systems, for example, these patterns of webs and networks, animated, living, constantly evolving and changing. So in Aotearoa, New Zealand, during those very first encounters between Māori and Europeans, both sides were riding the waves of rapid change. On both sides, they were fighting sailors, bold and innovative explorers who had mastered the art of exploring the world's largest ocean, people who were thinking creatively about the world around them. And as soon as Cook scientists stepped ashore, they began to explore local landscapes. They looked at and described local people, what they looked like, what they wore, their vessels and landscapes, and collected specimens of plants and animals. And as was the case with the first Polynesian settlers, those first European migrants to New Zealand were provoked into a flurry of innovation. The challenges of a long, often very dangerous sea voyage and adapting to new and unfamiliar landscapes taught those first European settlers about the need to innovate and to support each other, while a desire to escape the old encrusted hierarchies of Europe engendered an egalitarian spirit of sorts. In 1840, when the New Zealand Company began sending unauthorised shiploads of settlers to New Zealand, the British government was forced to intervene and instructed the incoming governor to seek the free, intelligent consent of the natives, expressed according to their own usages, to a settled form of government. This led to the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, which, if you read it in Māori, outlines a balance of powers between the leaders of the indigenous hapu, or kin groups, and the British Crown. In later years, these kind of relational habits of mind were also reflected in the early emancipation of women. So on this day, in 1893, today, women in New Zealand, including Māori women, became the first in the world to vote. On this day, in 1893. There was a growing fascination with native plants, animals and landscapes, and attempts to adapt to local environments. But at the same time, those old top-down hierarchical modes of control remained very, very powerful. Again, the old myths, including the Genesis creation story and the great chain of being, made it seem right and proper that civilized peoples should subdue the earth and have dominion over local plants, animals, and people. And as the new settlers sought to recreate familiar landscapes, they took political control and forcibly seized land from Māori and introduced plants and animals without much thought about how these would work in with local ecosystems. Many indigenous species of plants and animals lost their habitats over the next couple of hundred years or have been predated or hunted to extinction. Ideas of progress and improvement led to the wholesale clearance of land, the drainage of swamps and wetlands, the creation of large swathes of grassland for pastoral farming on steep, erodible hills. The idea that the world was created to serve human beings who can exploit it without limit led to systems of land use that led to severe erosion, choking waterways and harbours, the discharge of pollutants into streams, rivers, lakes and harbours. They struggle to survive these loadings of contaminants with catastrophic losses of biodiversity. And that's without even talking about climate change and what is happening in the Antarctic, for example, at the moment, and across the Pacific with our island neighbours, as well as in New Zealand. As Lord Nicholas Stern has said, we are playing Russian roulette with the planet, and the risks are existential. It couldn't be more serious. So for a long time, the Humboldtian vision of the cosmos as a dynamic whole, shaped by exchanges amongst complex living systems, was marginalised in modernist science. Today, however, radical divisions between mind and matter, culture from nature, people from the environment, and the disciplines from each other, are being confounded by the findings of contemporary science itself. Brain science, quantum physics, the environmental sciences, for instance. And at the same time, the scientific establishment is being challenged by an array of formidable, almost apocalyptic challenges. Climate change, losses of biodiversity, the warming and acidification of the oceans with their anthropogenic causes and impacts, and rising disparities in wealth and power and life chances, all of which demand a capacity from the scientific community to decipher the intricate dynamics of exchanges amongst interconnected, complex systems. In response, we are seeing an increasing focus on interdisciplinarity, relational forms of order, big data, symbiosis and its complex dynamic networks and exchanges, and attempts at a more inclusive, less fragmented understanding of the scientific project. But in many ways, this could be too little, too late. In our rapidly changing world, old habits of mind, in science as well as in our wider societies, are proving to be non-adaptive. As Alexander von Humboldt saw so clearly 200 years ago, challenges such as climate change, the degradation of waterways and the ocean, losses of biodiversity, are driven by human choices and actions. For this reason, it makes little sense to leave climate change to the climate scientists, losses of biodiversity to the biologists, the health of rivers, lakes, and wetlands to the freshwater scientists. And yet, that's almost inevitably what happens. As a matter of urgency, the scientific project, with its radical split between the natural and social sciences, should be reframed, you might say in a Humboldtian manner, to bring people back into the heart of these living networks, so we can better understand our relationships with each other and with these wider living systems, and bring them back into balance. We also need to set aside those old echoes of the great chain of being that dismiss indigenous philosophies and ways of thinking. Earlier, I noted a resonance between Humboldt's idea of the cosmos as a web of life, a living system, and Māori relational thinking and Pacifica. In New Zealand, some intriguing intersections are happening between these different philosophical trajectories. In 1975, for example, after generations of Māori protest about the loss of land and tikanga, customary ways of living, the Treaty of Waitangi Act was passed. This act established the Waitangi Tribunal to investigate and remedy breaches of the promises made in 1840 under the Treaty of Waitangi. Since that time, hundreds of claims have been lodged by Māori with the tribunal, addressing grievances that range from the loss or degradation of ancestral fisheries, lakes, rivers, forests, and harbours. Te reo Māori, the Māori language, indigenous plants and animals, as well as ancestral territories that were unjustly sold or confiscated. Over time, this process of debate and legal disputation has led to increasingly profound challenges to Western ways or modernist ways of thinking and governing. So in 2017, for example, in response to the Whanganui River Treaty claim, Te Awa Tupua Whanganui River Act was passed by the New Zealand Parliament, in which for the first time in the world, a river was recognised as a legal entity in its own right, with its own rights. As Whanganui people say, ko au te awa, ko te awa ko au, ke te mate te awa, ke te mate a hau. I am the river, and the river is me. If the river is dying, so am I. And indeed, we do have a lot of waterborne disease in New Zealand at present. So after 250 years of shared history, Inspired by these Māori insights, a nation-state has reimagined its relationship with the river, and this is now being extended into other policy areas around freshwater, for example, with Te Mana o Te Wai as part of the freshwater national policy statement, where the health of waterways is to be given priority over human uses. This kind of convergence between philosophical trajectories is also evident, I think, in the New Zealand government's 2019 wellbeing budget, which places a priority on the health and well-being of people and landscapes over profit. Well, that's debatable, but that seems to be a general aspiration. And the New Zealand Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, a young female Prime Minister, seeks a politics of kindness, and it draws on Māori ideas of ora, health and prosperity, well-being, and as our ambassador quoted, manaakitanga, looking after others, taking care of them, aroha, empathy, sympathy and fellow feeling. Notably, I guess, in her response to the 2018 mosque shootings in Christchurch, in which 51 Muslim people were killed at prayer and 49 were injured. At a time of public grief and horror in New Zealand, it was notable how many New Zealanders, including non-Māori, turned to Māori conceptions like aroha, empathy, fellow feeling, whānau, family, to express their sympathy for the victims, and defiance to the shooter. In the Pacific, you can see a similar kind of philosophical entanglement going on. So, for example, recently, His Highness Tuiatua Tupua Tamasese Paʻisiefi, the former head of state of Samoa, in a book on climate change, urged his readers to think like a fish in addressing climate change. Think from the vantage point of the ocean, or a bird, or a fish. And in context of attempts that are being made to sustainably manage the Pacific Ocean and its fisheries, these exclusive economic zones, which take continental habits of how to deal with land, continental land masses, if we think like a fish, we might understand that fish don't recognize these boundaries. In fact, they swim right through them all the time and get hoovered up by trawlers. And try and come up with devices that might imagine ways of working with the world's largest ocean in a way that preserves these other life forms from extinction. As part of what is going on in New Zealand at the moment, a waka, a flotilla of voyaging canoes, is travelling around, and its leaders are in the process of drafting a Declaration of the Rights of the Pacific Ocean, Hine Moana, as a way of trying to come up with an oceanic alternative to the law of the sea, which was drafted in Europe and based on continental ways of dealing with space, and which is simply not working. And they are looking for oceanic alternatives. So hierarchical habits of mind tend to uphold the status quo. They stifle philosophical creativity, the kinds of experiments which enable us to look outside our own ingrained, entrenched, unconscious forms of order. And those hierarchical habits can also stifle and conflict with academic freedom, the rights of scientists and scholars to freely communicate the patterns that they're finding. From Humboldt's time, academic freedom has been built into notions of participatory democracy, with built-in checks and balances between the judiciary, a free press, the legislature, and universities as communities of scholars who are free to explore the world and report on their findings without fear of political or economic reprisal. This is fundamental to the vitality of the scientific project, allowing new ideas and insights to be freely debated and experimented with. As von Humboldt himself said, without a diversity of opinion, the discovery of truth is impossible. And I think he would have liked a diversity of opinion that goes beyond the modernist project. I think he would have enjoyed it. But it goes with corresponding responsibilities to reach out to the widest possible array of talented people, enriching scientific inquiry with their diverse experiences, perspectives, and ancestral legacies, and to make scholarly findings accessible to the wider community, acknowledging them and thanking them for supporting scientific work with funding and other kinds of backing, including the privilege of academic freedom. The viability of the scientific project itself, I think, relies on this mutuality between scholars and their communities. When trust and mutuality between scientists and society are violated, science itself becomes vulnerable. In recent years, there have been many reports of scientific work being shut down in the Pacific as elsewhere, of databases and information sources, including those created by public funding, being declared inaccessible, and some scientists being threatened and intimidated because their findings threaten powerful commercial or political interests. For the sake of the scientific project itself, it's vital that scholars support each other in resisting these pressures and in strengthening their relations with the wider community, so that they will back the scientific community in retaining its integrity and its experimental spirit. After all, as Alexander von Humboldt understood so well, the deepest purpose of science is to illuminate the patterns of the wider world, to delight and inform the communities that support our endeavours, and to contribute to their order, their health, their well-being, their prosperity, including that of the non-human communities of which we are a part. And as communities of scholars, we must hold fast to our independence and have the courage and skill to protect the free exchange of ideas from those who would curtail these freedoms for their own purposes. So, bringing together these worlds, tangling them together, I would like to end by quoting my mentor and Kaumatua elder Edwina Sterling, who used to chant, "Whakarongo, whakarongo, whakarongo ki te tangi a te manu e karanga nei tui, 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 tui a." Listen, listen, listen to the cry of the bird calling, bind, join, be one. Bind above, bind below, bind within, bind without, tie the knot of humankind. The night hears, the night hears. Bind the lines of people coming down from long Hawaii, from great Hawaii, from Hawaii far away. Bind to the spirit, to the daylight, to the world of light. Nā reira, I aku rangatira. Ko tīnai ne tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora.
Thank you so much for this brilliant talk. I enjoyed it every second. It was really great. I think it's going to be a difficult challenge now to have a good discussion on such a wonderful talk, but nonetheless, as it is a tradition of the Cosmos Lecture, and since the Cosmos Lecture is also an endeavor where we try to start the communication and to keep the communication between science and the general public that we invite to the lectures, we will keep the tradition and we open the floor for your questions so that you can come into contact and into communication in this entangled world of Dames N. So there is your chance.
You have shown the Endeavour replica in a picture. And when has the Endeavour replica been rebuilt or constructed?
The Endeavour replica is a very interesting tale. It was originally built for an Australian magnate, somebody that obviously held a very had a very high regard for Captain James Cook and his voyages of exploration. So it was built for by an America's Cup sailor, actually, for this Australian very wealthy guy. And then it was owned by a charitable trust, and it sailed around the Pacific for quite a time as a charitable vessel with people going on board and learning how to sail in that old way. And I was privileged to be there when the Endeavour replica went back to Kealakekua Bay, where Captain James Cook was killed. And that was an extraordinary occasion, actually, because there had been a lot of debate about the idea of this ship coming back into the harbour, because after Cook was killed in Hawaii, many Hawaiians were killed. Lots, the crew went crazy. They shot and killed a lot of people. And those memories were still very vivid. And so there were people that were saying they would burn the ship. And so I was there, and I was invited by Herb Kane, who was actually one of the great inventors. The Polynesian Voyaging Society has revitalized Pacific voyaging. So that's why you see images of voyaging ships, voyaging waka also, that are sailing around the New Zealand coastline at the moment with the Endeavour replica. And so Herb was there, and he had invited me to be part of this amazing day. And the Hawaiians were interesting. What happened was they took us to church, and there was a service held. It was described as a service of healing. It involved a beautiful ceremonial hula, but people really didn't talk. Unlike in New Zealand, where there would be whai kōrero and people standing up and down and talking about these things, people sang, they danced, and then everybody went on board the Endeavour replica to have a lunch together. So it's a very interesting, and it's, as I say, on the New Zealand coastline at the moment, and it's controversial there too. And as a result of the voyage that's happening, both with the Endeavour replica, but also with these voyaging waka, one of which has sailed from Tahiti, we are having all sorts of debates about knowledge, about power, about colonialism, about the legacies of the past, but maybe most importantly, what kind of future we want as a country. So that's a great question, thank you, because it's not just about a replica of a ship. It's about a history that's still living.
So thanks for a great talk again. So you mentioned the 4 capitals set up by the New Zealand government, human capital, etc. And I was wondering how the Maori philosophy and way of life is involved in this and can be integrated. And second question, how is the balance between scientific understanding and political decision be guaranteed in this?
Okay, so there will be colleagues in the audience who could speak to this as well. But I think what is going on there is the beginnings of an experiment. So you notice they've got, I don't know, can I flick back to that slide very quickly of the 4 capitals? Yeah. They've got this motif of weaving. So there's this idea of weaving that's been brought in there. But the idea that environment, taiao, can be described as a natural capital, of course, doesn't fit very well with Māori philosophy at all. Well-being, if you translate it into ora, this idea of well-being, health, prosperity, vitality, yeah, that would work. But as yet, nobody has had the courage to try and translate this budget into Māori. I think it will happen. And when it does, it will be fascinating to see just how that process works out. Because what I notice in the acts that are being passed around for example, declaring the Whanganui River to be a living, legal being in its own right, with its own rights, the preamble to the act is in Māori. And people have expressed, the Whanganui iwi expressed their own thoughts about what they intend with this legislation in their own language. And then it goes into describing it as, for example, a legal person. Many of us would say that te awa tupua, a tupua is not a person, it's actually something from the ancestral realm, which is greater and older than people, far greater and older. So a river is really, in a way, diminished by being described as a legal person. So what I'm saying is we're in the process of experimentation. And we're just at the beginnings of it. I don't know where it's going to go, but I think it will probably end up going in some very interesting places. It depends on how long this trajectory of experimentation can last, whether it can survive the kind of international pressures that come on to nation states in this age of the internet and international capital, is anyone's guess. But yeah, so what I'm saying is these are experimental moments, and no more than that yet.
It appears to me that these 4 capitals are like a boiled-down version of the global sustainability development goals of the United Nations, and it seems to be much easier to communicate these 4 capitals to people instead of trying to communicate 17 SDGs plus 192 something sub-goals.
Yeah, well, there is a relationship with the United Nations goals, and well-being is easy. If you understand order at all, it's easier than well-being because it relates to the health of people, of its health, well-being, prosperity. And as I said, it can apply to an individual, it can apply to a family, it can apply to a community, it can apply to an ecosystem, a forest, a river. You don't have to be a scientific expert to tell if a river is dying. And I think this is one of the things that we are working through is how to... there is a kind of alienation that can happen with scientific language and the quantification project. If you're talking about a river in terms of how many parts per million you can have of, phosphorus and nitrogen and so on, people don't really understand that, but they do understand if the waterway is something their children can swim in or they can fish in. And so this is going to be part of a project, I suspect, of trying to make science an everyday, something which is accessible to everyday people, which is not just in the hands of the scientists. And then I think we might see progress on things like climate change. We might see progress on things like biodiversity, when people think of other plants, of animals, as tied integrally, locked together with their own future and that of their children and their grandchildren.
We have another question here.
You have fascinated our audience with your incredible talk. Thank you so much. I was personally impressed by words of the poet. I want to ask what's happened with the Maori language nowadays? Do you have book in Maori language? Because the philosophy and how they express themselves, it's, touched me very much. Therefore, I want to know what is with the Maori language. Do you have the books and something like this? Thank you so much.
Well, as I say, there are colleagues in the audience who can speak very well to these matters. But what has happened in Aotearoa is that the Māori language, after years and years of being forbidden to be spoken in schools, Eruera Sterling, my mentor, was punished at school for speaking Māori. He was a beautiful speaker of the language, but he was punished as a child. And my generation, I guess, people like Hannah Jackson and others, fought furiously to have the language reinstated as a living language. And we now have what we call kohanga reo, which are language nests, where fluent speakers share their language with children. So kids learn when they're little, very small, as children are able to do, to pick up a language that's spoken around them all the time. We have now schools which are taught in Māori, and whare wānanga also where classes are taught in Māori, and so many of my colleagues at the University of Auckland, we were just talking about this, the perplexity of colleagues in other disciplines who are now being asked to mark exams that have been written in Māori because it's a legal language of New Zealand, and you have a colleague that sits there in the chemistry department and is deeply perplexed. And we are also in Māori studies having to try and translate some of this stuff. It's let's say an epistemological challenge of some magnitude. But it's great because it's a very beautiful language, and as I was trying to communicate something which is philosophically very sophisticated. And having been studying it since I was young, I can say that you can spend a lifetime and still be learning every minute about these things. So, yeah, the Māori language is alive and well. It's still at risk, but I think that is changing as the younger generation of people that have gone through the schools that are taught in Māori, they're coming through now, they're leaders, they're politicians, they're in the media, they're teachers, they're scientists, and that is changing a lot of things in our country.
We have another question over here, please.
Hello, my name is Delphine from Berlin, and I'm questioning the subject of the damage of nature and lands. Humboldt previewed already the damages and described, or maybe also some methods to prevent or to renaturalize the damaging. And my concrete question for New Zealand and the small islands in the Pacific is, are there any projects of anti-drowning in political, technical and renewable energies?
Yes, I think as with the rest of the world, and as I was saying about the scientific project itself, just as the scientific project is coming to grips with the fact that some of its own deep structures may not be adaptive. So we're all coming to terms with the fact that many of our everyday ways of living are not either. You know, they're putting our own children and our grandchildren at risk. And in the Pacific, that's very immediate because there are communities, including, I trained originally as a linguist, as an anthropological linguist, and the first thing I ever wrote was grammar of a Polynesian outlier atoll, Ontong Java or Luangniua. People are having to shift off the island because the storms are going across the island. It's an atoll, very flat, but also the freshwater lens underneath the island is being contaminated with salt, which means they can't grow their own food anymore. So these things are very immediate for our Pacific neighbours. Also the coastlines are all being attacked, of course, in New Zealand as well. So yes, there's a lot of talk about this. There are increasing numbers of practical projects where people are trying to see what they can do. One of the things that's interesting in the Pacific is that my colleagues are showing that quite often it's the nature of the infrastructure that we put onto these spaces, it's fixed. But the islands, they're not necessarily sinking or even shrinking. In many cases, what they're doing is they're shifting. So the sand, you know, the geologists and the geomorphologists are describing processes where some of the islands are actually growing, but the beaches are shifting. So the place where you built the airport is going to go underwater. But there might be a good place for a new airport over there, but nobody's got the money. So I think we have to rethink engineering. We have to rethink, you know, the kind of materials that we use. There's a lot of rethinking we have to do in all of the scientific disciplines if we're going to help our children and grandchildren adapt to this rapidly changing world.
Ko pūtawa ki te maunga, ko rangitai ki te awa, ko ngā tiawa te iwi, ko mā tātua te waka. Ko te arikirangi mama ki tēnei e me kau atu ana ki a koe i tēnei pō, e te whāia mō tō kōrero i whakatūwhere tia ai i te ara, kia hikoi ai tahi ai tātou katoa i te pai tawhiti. No reira, tēnei rā nā mihi ki a koe i tēnei pō, mai a hau o tiraki mai taku rangatira nei a te here kie o te papatonga rewa kāmihi atu rā. He pātai tāku e pāna ki te hunga o tēnei whenua e rapu haere ana i etahi o a mātou taonga pēra hoki i te haka. Ara? Pēra hoki i te haka. He pātai tāku ki a koe, mena he whakaaro kia hikoi tahi atu tātou i runga i te whakaaro kotahi ki te pai tawhiti. No reira, kauri atu ki te reo tuarua, ki te reo tuatoru pia i rito i tēnei whenua, i te reo pīkete Pākehā. I apologize, my German's quite lacking, but my English isn't so bad. Professor Dame and Salmond, it truly is an honor to be in your presence this evening, and I'd like to acknowledge you for sharing such a wonderful talk, such a wonderful mātauranga knowledge for the audience here this evening, and I think that everybody can take something quite special and unique from this experience. My question for you actually is whether you have a perspective and how we can move forward, given a situation that isn't new to Māori. It's not new to Māori, and Germans aren't the only instigators of this situation, but it's around this matter of appropriation, and it's around this matter of cultural appropriation. Mena ka titiro mātou ki tēnei me te haka. You know, you think about in our culture we have many treasures to share. But one of our special treasures that has been taken and appropriated without our control, without our sovereign control, and you talk about sovereignty, is this thing about the haka, it's the war dance. Everybody here, does everybody know what a haka is? The haka, or the war dance? Now that's quite special to us and that's quite unique to us. But we are faced most recently with a situation where there are certain groups or companies, commercial enterprises, that take aspects of our culture, without actually having a dialogue with us, without getting a full understanding around what it actually means to be doing the haka, what it actually means to be speaking te reo Māori. So I'm not angry at anybody, but I am very, very hopeful that that you may be able to actually share a perspective with us and how we actually may walk hand in hand, tātou ngā Māori, mea tātou, and our German friends, with Māori people and German friends, walking together hand in hand to a brighter future in a way that is both respectful and beautiful, and where, you know, like it's the title of your lecture. It's these entangled worlds. So koira tāku, osira ngā mihi, ngā mihi, ngā mihi.
Ka nui aku mihi atu ki a koe mo tērā pātai, me e rā kōrero hōhonu. It's, as I said, te reo Māori is alive and well, and I knew there would be experts out there in the audience, and it's wonderful to have you here tonight. And the question about Edward Sterling, my mentor, used to say, mana and money don't mix. Very difficult to see something like the haka, which is an expression of ancestral pride, of connection with ancestors, that brings courage, that brings strength and fortitude, being used for purposes which are to do with profit in particular, or by people that really don't understand what these tikanga, these practices are all about. There are some really nice examples of things happening in Germany. For example, one thing I can think of is a taonga, a very ancient carving, a popo from a house in Pourewa Island in Uawa in Tolaga Bay that was picked up, probably presented to Tupaia, the high priest navigator who sailed with Cook, and taken back to Britain, and it found its way somehow to Tübingen in Germany, and it was in the castle there. And Volker Harms, who was the very fine curator of that museum for a time, recognised this treasure from a sketch of it that was made when the taonga was in Britain. And just recently, that has been brought back to New Zealand by the curators from Tübingen. It's been brought back very formally, and as a result of a relationship that was built up over, I guess, Armedia, a decade, maybe more. My daughter Armedia is here, and she's been very involved in that as well with Wayne Ngata and others. And the beautiful thing about that was that the curators in Tübingen understood how much this carving from a particular school of carving, which was also a school of learning. So Māori had whare wānanga, which are like universities. They were schools of learning, called Te Rāwhioro, a very famous school of learning. And this carving had survived. Stone tool carved, very beautiful, quite small, and it was in Germany. And the curators in Germany understood how important it was to people back home in New Zealand, because those people had come, had forged relationships, they'd talked. And so eventually it was permitted to travel back to New Zealand. So that's a nice example of how relationality, genuine relationships, which recognise the mana on both sides, can do something productive. But I agree with you completely, and I'm not sure what the solution is to corporates and others that just steal stuff, basically. They just take it. I'm thinking too, I almost showed a slide when I was talking about the mosque shootings of these Muslim schoolboys dressed in their white skull caps and their white costumes, performing a haka of defiance to the shooter. And these were Muslim kids in a New Zealand school. For them, the best way to express how they felt about that guy that shot so many of their people was to perform a haka. I don't think anyone really thought of that as appropriation because it was so heartfelt. But these are delicate, you know, mana is such an important thing, the dignity and I think again Alexander von Humboldt, you know, this idea of the dignity of the person, the dignity of a cultural tradition. It's right to thrive and prosper and to help instruct us when we need new ideas and new thoughts. Not to seize those thoughts, but to be inspired by them, to come up with something new, perhaps. And so that's the sort of hope that I've been exploring in this lecture. It's not about appropriation, it's about saying, what a wonderful idea, what a wonderful way of thinking about our relationships as human beings with other forms of life. It fits well with complex network in many ways. Thinking of ourselves as kin in some ways is scientifically not a strange thought, if you're a geneticist. And perhaps this will help us come up with new legal structures, new scientific structures, new ways of framing the world as Alexander von Humboldt did so long ago. And yeah, that's the hope, that's the dream. But to do it without just taking, just seizing, without permission, without a proper relationship backwards and forwards, without giving anything back in exchange. That's a patu wairua. It harms the spirit. It breaks the relationship. It fractures the world. Yeah, kia ora.
I think this has been a wonderful set of words to conclude this cool discussion. I mean, I have a lot more questions that I could ask, and I think there's many people in the room that still would want to discuss with you. There might be still an option. But I think at this point in time, we should conclude the discussion to this talk. And this, I think your last remarks also have been a wonderful wrapping up, concluding remark of all of the Cosmos lecture series that we have been able to bring into the Hall of Senate here at Humboldt-Universität zu Berlin in 2019. Before I let you from the stage, I should say thank you again to you. And like with all the speakers, we have two little things that we would want to give to you. The one is just a bag. It has one of Humboldt's drawings on it. It's good to go to the Saturday market and just get a bit of groceries. I'm not sure. I mean, usually New Zealanders are tea-drinking persons. I don't know whether you are a coffee drinker or not. We always have this fancy cap with the drawings that Alexander von Humboldt did himself of these insects on the cup. You know what Alexander von Humboldt was saying about coffee? He said it's condensed sunlight. Yeah, but I think for a good cup of tea that would work as well. Yes. And also, we have been editing a series of bookmarks. For each of the Cosmos lectures, there is one bookmark, and in the back it has the titles of the talks and the people speaking. You will find yours as well in this collection. This is the last one, so there won't be any further bookmarks in 2019. Those in the audience that have now found out that this is a great lecture series to follow, we will be continuing in 2020, but you will have to wait until the summer term, and we will keep you communicated on that on due time. So enjoy the bookmarks, enjoy the time in Berlin. Thank you very much again for this wonderful talk.
Vielen Dank. Vielen Dank.